Emma's communication partner. The agenda today will begin with introductions, introducing the AOC cadre. Next, we'll discuss the key root issues, what exactly is being examined. The third item on the agenda is access to employment and looking at the various issues related to employment accessibility. We'll have questions for group discussion and then feedback on questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Okay, so I will start off the introduction. My name is Marcos Castillo. I'm a 39-year-old quadriplegic with a rare autoimmune disease similar to Guillain-Barré. I'm actually from Arizona. I was born and raised in Yuma, Arizona, and have been living in the Maricopa County area around Phoenix for about the last 20 years. I heavily started getting into advocacy probably about 8 or so years ago, and am a father of 3. I've been living with my girlfriend and kids for roughly about 18 years. I've been paralyzed about 21 years. And I'm very happy to be here with everyone to see how we can move this advocacy ball forward.
Who do you want to go next?
Ooh, who would like to go next?
I could read Josh. Josh isn't able to be with us today, but Josh Wilson is one of our AOCs. He's a 48-year-old man who has cerebral palsy and lives in Richmond, Virginia. Over the last 20 years, Josh has been an advocate to make change for people with disabilities, especially in Virginia. He's spoken at the Virginia General Assembly several times on topics related to consumer-directed care, assistive technology, and Medicaid waiver waiting lists. Information IT is Josh's passion. He's worked at Virginia Commonwealth University and as a volunteer at several nonprofits doing IT. He has a degree from J. Sargent Reynolds College in this field. Josh describes bureaucracy as his most frustrating foe and his turtles and the beach as the 2 things that bring him the most peace. Josh lives in his own apartment and wants to make sure all people with disabilities have the opportunity to live on their own or with any people they choose. Emma, would you like your communication partner to read yours?
Yeah.
Okay, she says yes. So Emma Budway is a 25-year-old, unreliably speaking autistic who is passionate about advocating for equity and social justice issues. She is committed to making the world more accepting of the neurodiverse and advocating for inclusion of the non-speaking community. Emma believes that everyone should have access to opportunities for education, community, housing, and employment that are foundational for a meaningful life. She encourages autistic self-advocates to push for fuller access and inclusion. Emma is featured in The Reason I Jump, an award-winning documentary about autism around the world. A recent focus of her experiential writing centers around her living a self-determined life in an inclusive, affordable, and diverse community. Thank you.
I have D'Arcee's that I'd like to read. Thank you, Emma. D'Arcee Charington Neal is an award-winning professional storyteller and 4th-year doctoral candidate at The Ohio State University in English and Disability Studies. He's focusing on the intersections of Black digital media and disability within aphorism. with a double master's in creative writing and rhetorical composition through the lens of audio narratology. He works to tell stories of the Afro-Panstemic or Black disabled people who exist as phantoms within the community as both a power and a problem. Critically analyzing digital blackface and ableism across popular culture, he's a recipient of the 2017 NBC Universal Digital Media Scholarship and a winner of Best English Graduate Research at Ohio State University for 2020. However, when not theorizing about Black techno agency, playing video games, or crying over Grey's Anatomy, he believes that the future can and should be both accessible and in Wakanda forever. And I believe I'm last. I'm Teresa Champion with the I live in Northern Virginia. I'm a longtime civic and community activist and attorney. I've been involved in the disability community in Washington State and in Virginia since 1996. My son received a diagnosis of autism. I advocate in Richmond and on Capitol Hill and have been appointed over the years to serve on community-wide and statewide boards in both Washington and Virginia. Today, I serve by appointment of Governor McAuliffe and Governor Northam to the Virginia Candace PANS Advisory Council. I also serve on the board of Virginia Autism Project, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be an agent of change. Thank you all so much for listening to our introductions. Today, we've got we as a group have been discussing a lot of issues related to the disability community. And with the support of someone who has been facilitating our conversations, we've been addressing key root issues that are barriers to the disability community that include access to meaningful employment, access to affordable housing, access to quality education, marriage equality, access to financial services, communications and community access, and of course, criminal justice. This is just an example, and Marcos, you can talk a little bit about this, of what this picture is.
So we, through ECNV, we were connected with a lady who helped us map out the frustrations that we knew existed within our community, but couldn't really put it in a visual format so that we can explore it and tackle it better. And she helped us formulate a root systems map. And as we were just speaking, having conversations, reaching out to people, bringing them in, she was forming a map that began to kind of show us how everything was interconnected and gave us a better idea of how best to tackle it now that we could visualize it a little bit. When we pulled back from, this was more zoomed in, when she pulled back so that we could kind of see what it was that we were working on, it was like a double-edged sword. We were able to look at it and say, okay, this is how we can tackle this. We can attack it from different angles, but it also gave us the opportunity to see how complex it actually was and how widespread it was. And this was only after a couple of sessions. So when we, if you can give me just a second to look over that slide.
Oh, sorry. Oh, this one?
Oh, yes, that one. Oh, yes. So as we were looking through that last slide, we started noticing that there was some things that if we addressed those and tackled those, that it would spread into the other ones much more easily. So we started picking out these major ones that we spoke to a couple of slides ago. So we know that money, and specifically money from Social Security, is substantially the root for many disabled people. But this conversation aims to look beyond that key issue at the possibility of what is available. So specifically, two of the AOCs, Josh and I, have been very weary about receiving money for the work that we are doing, specifically because it puts our resources and our life-saving insurance at risk. So we haven't been able to tackle a good way to pass those barriers, because a lot of the times the restrictions are state to state instead of one over encompassing at the federal level.
So today, as Marcos was saying, we were able to discuss multiple issues, but today's issue we're discussing is access to employment. And we're so thankful that you are here to give us your input. As you know, with the rise of remote work options, we're finally able to be mainstream in many ways. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities does remain historically low, but it's still very high in comparison to the overall employment rate. There still remain key challenges. There's a lack of search options. Sorry. I'm sorry. There's a lack of search options made available and accessible for disabled people. How do you find jobs? How do you know where to go look for accessible jobs? Ableism prevents quality employment from being available. Issues of accommodation make disclosure difficult for a person with disabilities to disclose their disability to their employer. Lack of disability work culture make hiring and retainment hard. And there's a lack of upward mobility in jobs that prevent disabled people from substantial gainful employment.
So a few ground rules for the discussion. We've devoted 15 minutes per topic. Not everything will be covered, of course, but we encourage you to reach out so that we can keep in touch with further updates. To ensure that everyone has a chance to speak, we ask that responses to question, if voice, be limited to 2 to 3 minutes roughly. Please be mindful of the space and everyone's ability to participate. If available, please post your questions and comments in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will address them as we can. Teresa and I will be monitoring the chat. We're using 2 different formats, so hopefully we can stay on top of it. And there we go. Okay, the next slide is Emma. If Emma would like her assistant to read it out for her.
Sure. So we know that businesses vary in their responses to disabled people in the workforce, but in the current climate of diversity and inclusion, spaces are being made available for people with disabilities with a lack of qualified candidates. Do you see yourself as employable? And what do you think makes disabled people unwilling to apply for jobs? Also, what barriers do you have to working, and what would help to overcome them? And we're open for comments. Thank you.
Does anybody want to be recognized or called in for discussion? Any comments?
I can start the ball rolling a little bit. I can speak on my end. A big barrier to my employment here in Arizona has been what my resources will look like if and when I do have a consistent gainful employment. What the limits are for me here in my state, and how that will affect my Social Security and my Medicare and Medicaid. It seems to me like every time I ask a certain organization, I get a different set of answers. And all of that, it kind of plants a seed of doubt in my head on how I will be able to move forward if later on down the line I don't have that employment anymore, or I have a gap in employment, or things of that sort.
Yeah.
So we have some comments in the chat. Cassie knows that she is employable, but she doesn't have transportation. She got a job, but she had to turn it down due to transportation. Thank you, Marie, for mentioning transportation. We have talked about that as a huge barrier. Andrew is saying that a barrier for him is getting to the workplace. Again, transportation. We have a hand raised. Marcos, Candace would like to comment.
Hi, Candace, you're recognized.
Thank you. Hi, this is Candace Cable. I'm in Los Angeles, California, and I do see myself as employable, and I have been employed. And I recently just left a job where I was working for a company, a startup that's creating a new medical device for disabled folks. And I'll be starting another job with the Disability Rights Legal Center here in Los Angeles. And I think that one of the things that stops, and Marco said this pretty well, is that people don't understand if they're getting any kind of benefits in the system, either state or federal, they don't understand what the limits are, as well as what are some of the resources that they can put in place, like ABLE accounts. ABLE accounts are really helpful in being able to funnel money so that people don't go over what is allotted in bank accounts for, say, SSI. And there's some limits on the ABLE accounts too, because you have to be disabled before a certain age, and they're starting to change some of that. I have a spinal cord injury from a car accident. I'm a paraplegic, and that's been since 1975 at the age of 21. And so I was on a couple of those different programs, SSDI, because I worked before my injury, and then started working and have been off and on of it. But now that I'm over the age of 66, I'm 68, I now have my Social Security, which doesn't get too affected by the amount of money that I make. And so there's, I think, a lack of education for disabled folks. And then I think on the other side of it, as barriers, is I think there's a lack of education for employers and just non-disabled people in general about disability. And so there's this massive, and it was in your tree, fear that a lot of people have about us because they don't think we're capable, because they've bought into the stereotypes and stigmas that is a societal overlay on disability, that we're not capable. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great points.
No, and your story is amazing because you kind of run the gamut from, you said in 1975 was your injury. So you've been through RSA, vocational rehab, the ADA signing, all of these markers along the way. So you have a very broad view of what the game actually looks like. And a lot of what we're talking about here in this group of the AOCs is interdependency as opposed to independent living. So thank you for your input.
Yeah, and Marcos, I just would add, because I see D'Arcee's got his hand up, is that it is a game, and it's really lousy game. And it's our lives as disabled folk are really labor intensive already. Just because we're trying to create access in a world that doesn't create access. for us readily. And lots of times people think inclusion means access, and it doesn't. And so those kind of points are really important to be able to bring forward, is a real understanding of what it takes for us to navigate society. Oops,
Yes,
sorry.
thank you so much. So I see we have D'Arcee back. I'm gonna give him a minute to, he has his hand up, but I'm gonna give him a minute to introduce himself, even though we already introduced him. Oh, let me unmute you.
No, it's fine. Y'all ain't got to do that. I mean, hi, everybody. I apologize for being late. I was at a telehealth appointment and I'm still alive. So that's always good to know. No, I just want to thank you so much for your comment, Candace. And you look amazing. I just want to point that out. You really do. But I wanted to ask this. So the reason we came about and crafted this question was because, you know, we've been talking to a number of employers and a number of people who do this work. And one of the comments that struck out as interesting to us from a person we talked to in May was that, you know, she works with a lot of companies that want to do the work, that want to hire disabled people, but they don't see the candidates. And so she was saying, like, everybody is trying to create these spaces now to bring these people in. But, you know, it reminded me of, well, I lived in DC and there was a ginormous Marriott being opened on 9th Street. It was 1,000 people. It's massive. And one of the stipulations for that building being built was that the mayor of DC requires that 80% of the staff of that Marriott is Black DC underrepresented residents who are poor. And they had to agree to that in order to get that building built, right? And so, but I remember when I went to the event, the Marriott people, the CEO, whatever, was complaining that there were no applicants. They had all these spaces and no applicants. And so we were just trying to think about that, like, you know, why would disabled people not want to show up if you can see that, you know, they say that this is available and these kinds of spaces are wanted and they want these types of people. I still feel like there's a side of the equation where disabled people themselves may not necessarily want to apply because, as y'all have pointed out, rightfully so, benefits are a huge factor. So I was wondering, is it a question of corporations working around these benefits? Because I was just trying to think, like, what would it look like if Amazon, as powerful as it is, worked with you know, a vocational rehabilitation organization in wherever, in the state of Washington or Virginia, where they have HQ2 now, you know, to basically be like, we know that SSDI and SSI is an issue. So in partnership with Voc Rehab, we have created this specialty thing. But I also feel like if you do something like that, then the general public is going to be like, wait a minute, we don't get all these extra considerations. We don't get all this like specialty attention. So like, why do y'all get to have a created specialty employment pocket that
but they do, right? That's the thing. They do get those investments made into them. And right now that you're imagining the corporate world with that, and I'm going to tie in the transportation that Candace and I believe somebody else had mentioned just a little bit, oh, Ms. Vernon. And it's during the boom in Detroit, GM, you know, built this big, beautiful building, and into that building, they had public transportation. There was buses that were run by the city and subsidized by the corporation so that their employees could get there and build them as many cars as possible, as fast as possible. That is a perfect example of the corporation saying, hey, you know what? We're going to need to get these employees here. They just migrated. They don't have vehicles to be able to, you know, X, Y, and Z. Let's implement something to be able to bridge that gap so that we can make as much money as possible.
Do we have any other hands or comments? I think that question, do you see yourself as employable, is, so Marie is speaking with in the chat, the lack of qualified candidates is directly reflective in some cases due to education. Yeah, we've talked about education too being broken. Cassie has struggled with technology, for example, due to the fact that she didn't get to take certain IT electives due to elective spots being taken by special ed classes. So even if she could get to the job, she wouldn't have the skills needed. Also, when she went to Woodrow Wilson, which is a vocational rehab, when teachers got COVID, they had no subs, so she missed out on the classes then. Good point about education and not getting the necessary training.
Yes, we had a huge discussion about education. And like anything, we have always said that education is the key to be able to elevate yourself out of poverty and things of that sort. But it also instills a mindset in the student himself. And that mindset will carry on throughout their lives. So if this student is being told that they can't keep up with the other students at the school, if they aren't given the opportunity to demonstrate that they can be efficient, all of that carries on into the workplace later on. So if we're planting these seeds of doubt in children with disabilities from the beginning, those seeds are going to grow into trees, and later on it's going to be very difficult for us on the tail end to tell them forget everything that was ever told to you and start new so that you can be employable. That's a almost impossible task for many of us to carry. So I do believe education is key so that we can get a better workforce or a more qualified workforce, so that if they can be employed, they will be employed.
I remember one of the saddest things that we had. I used to work for United Cerebral Palsy Incorporated at the national office, and one of the saddest things that we had to do was to turn down. So there was like a lot of people with cerebral palsy who would call our office, and they would literally say, "I want a job," and you know, it's difficult to explain to a person with cerebral palsy that you called the national, like you called United Cerebral Palsy, and like we don't necessarily give out jobs. Like that's not what we do. And furthermore, when I asked my boss about it, he was like, you know, do they have a resume? You know, do they have skills? Do they have like, have they taken classes? Like, you know, and it was just kind of, you know, it was very ableist in the way that he was like responding to their requests. And, you know, but it really just kind of cements into point this idea that without proper prerequisites, you know, people don't necessarily see you as employable, which of course, as y'all have pointed out, is based upon a bunch of, you know, barriers and skills and things that people have to get over. So Marcos, I think this next question is yours.
Oh, okay. So we're going to move on to question number 2. So we know the question of accommodation is a thorny and complex issue that employers have thoughts about. When do you think it's appropriate to tell an employer about your accommodation? Also, do you think ableism plays a role? I will open it up to anyone who has questions. You could raise your input. You can raise your hand or add it to the chat.
I just start this off by saying I have the best anecdote about this. I worked as a consultant for the World Bank, and they brought me in to increase disabled people. They want disabled people working in the bank, and they didn't know how to do it. So one of the comments I made was, y'all need to revamp how you do accommodations, and because right now everything is tied to a employer work group. I don't know how to describe it, but like a voluntary work group that disabled people in the bank kind of crafts. And it's like it feels very like, yay, you know, help us, you know, we're a group of people, we work here. They have no power. They have no substance. It's just really there for people to make people feel good. And what I said was, you need an actual group of people with power who can speak directly to the CEO and to the bank itself. And the HR department looked at me like I was insane. And they were just like, that's dumb. Why would we need that? And when I went to lunch with a coworker who was blinded, had a seeing eye dog, the timing was perfection, because we sat down, her seeing eye dog ditto sat with us as he was trained to do. And some random woman next to the table next to us looked at her dog and very loudly was like, ew, oh my God, I hate those things. Why do they even let those people in this building? And she was being very loud. So she was like, oh my God, ew, let's move. So she got her tray with her friend, and they both got up and walked all the way across the cafeteria and sat down on the other side. So without missing a beat, I leaned over to the HR director and I said, and that is the reason why, I don't know who this woman was or what her job title is. I said, but let's just imagine she's the one responsible for recruitment. Any blind person who says they need a seeing eye dog on that form will have their application thrown in the trash based totally off her own biases and ableism. And tell me I'm lying. And she looked me dead in my face and said, point taken. And they changed the rule. So the timing couldn't have been more perfect, but this is the point that I was trying to make about this question. Employers try to act like they know, they're like, we want to do the best for our people, and we're trying to do the best thing, but they don't know like when or how to bring this up, which is why we wanted to pose this question to a wider audience.
And Candace has her hand up.
Go
Yes,
ahead, Candace.
thanks, D'Arcee. That's a great story. So I'll go to the end of it. I think ableism plays a role, and I think internalized ableism that disabled people have plays a major role too, because we are so used to trying to get by, figure out how we're going to make it work in a world where non-disabled folks don't have to think about that, but we're trying to fit in, and we don't want to make it too hard, or we don't want to be too angry so that we get our needs met. And so I think there's levels, there's layers of ableism that are there, because in the hiring, if I'm getting hired by an employer and I know I'm going to need an accommodation, I spend energy figuring out when would be the best time during that interview to be able to articulate it. Now, I can't hide what I got going on because I use a wheelchair for mobility. So I'm not a person with a disability that's non-visible. And so you can see, I definitely need physical access to the entire environment. But there's a level of ableism from an employer that comes forward because the way that productivity happens for someone who's non-disabled as opposed to someone who's disabled is different. And they usually are working off of this old model of what productivity looks like for non-disabled folk. And so when asking for an accommodation, they always, at least I've heard in my lifetime, they talk about it being special, like making a special accommodation. And it's not a special accommodation. It's an accommodation that needs to be made because it was never put in place before, so that I didn't have to ask for it, because the world wasn't actually built for disabled people to operate in. So we're slowly but surely changing that. And in the workplace, there are so many concepts that are old and outdated, and the way we work. I mean, the pandemic was the first year of the pandemic where everybody was sent home, and learning to work remotely was a blessing for disabled people, because we all knew that we could do pretty much most of everything remotely and be able to get it done. And previously in the past, we've been told that we can't. So I like to really be able to tell them upfront what my needs are. And as I said, mine's pretty obvious in that space, But there are other things that I would request. And one is a quiet place, you know, a place where I can go and it can be quiet. Because when I get a ton of input all at once, I need a break from it so that I can process it. And it takes me just a little longer to process. It could be, I don't know what it is, but it just takes a little longer. And those kind of things are really out of people's realm in thought process of what productivity looks like. Because if I have that place to be able to go quiet for 15 minutes, I can come back, I'm cleared out, and I'm ready to hit the pavement. And yeah, and so I would say for myself, I'm upfront with my accommodations, but I still feel it out when I'm talking to an employer. And I think there's levels of ableism on both sides that happen, and that we have to dismantle as disabled people our own internalized ableism.
So I hope you don't mind, Joanna. Thank you, Candace. Joanna, I hope you don't mind if I ask you to jump in here, because you and I have had conversations on this topic, and I know you have some really valuable input.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not good with technology, so I wasn't sure. Oh gosh. I have cerebral palsy, so my issues are pretty front and center. So I have found that generally I kind of say it right off the bat in the interview because you can tell. What I always find interesting though, probably the last 2 job interviews I've had, they've asked me pretty much in the interview what accommodations I need. And I know some of them, but a lot of times I don't know all of them until I really get into the job. And as far as my history, I've been employed steadily since 1985, doing in the public mental health, different sectors.
Thank you. That's a good point. You may not know all of the necessary accommodations for the job until you get into it.
I mean, I was gonna say,
go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment and say that, I mean, I think that that's a really good point. I also think that employers will balk at that at that concept because, you know, I think that there's already an innate fear of like, how much more do we need to do for this person? You know, it's like they and I'm not trying to be funny, but
No, I think this accommodation question is kind of being overlapped by the disclosure question. And the disclosure question is one that has always kind of interested me. And actually, so in different forms you disclose, right? So when I moved into this house, I chose not to disclose because it already took us 6 months to find a new place to live, and I didn't want there to be a bias in the application process to where they're like, oh, you know what, a wheelchair is really gonna mess that new drywall that we just put in, or it's really gonna mess up the carpet, or, you know, things like that. So we had the conversation about do you disclose your disability when you're going to apply for a job, and at what point do you disclose it, because you're going to have to disclose it if you're going to need accommodations, which most humans do. It's just,
I mean,
the
can I just say something
accommodations.
that's evil?
Yeah.
I'm gonna say something that's evil. I feel like people only use that card when they need it. So like, let's be honest. People only throw that card out when they actually need it. So it's like, oh, I need, you know, I mean, in the federal government, it was flex time or whatever. It was the ability, it was the ability to come to work later and to do your work at home more because, you know, you're like, I need a mental health day. You know, quite frankly, after the 2016 election, I emailed my boss and the day of the election, I said, I can't come in. I need a mental health day. And he responded and said, we don't have those. This is the federal government.
Mm.
And I wrote back and said, you can call it whatever you want. I said, but I won't be in, and you can mark it on my timesheet as whatever you would like. And I did not come in for the rest of the week. And so, the point is, I think, just like with placards on cards or on cars, or, the ability to try to get Social Security benefits or whatever, people will
Or
throw
HIPAA
that
violations.
Huh?
HIPAA violations in 2020
sure.
were the rage.
Sure. I just want to point that out. It's like, there's always the constant, and I made that point in the comment section. I actually, because I remember somebody argued with me on a panel, and he tried to say, don't act like disabled people. He said, what did he say? Something along the lines of, he said, you make it sound like only wheelchair users are the ones dealing with the issue of not being seen at a workplace. And he was like, there are disabled people in every room. And I told him, I said, and I agree with you. I said, but what you don't do? You don't speak up. I said, so while it may be true that there are a lot of invisible disabilities in most rooms, no one would ever know that, which means that I'm the person that is getting all of the questions. I'm the one that has to fill out all the forms and convince my boss that I can still do a job, because the rest of you choose to stay silent,
Marie,
which makes it harder.
Marie has a good point here on with Cassie. She says, I think younger people are disclosing more often than the older generation as their views have changed. Cassie, for example, tells everyone she has autism, as do many of her friends. They grew up with having handicap parking, IEPs. That's an important point, that now with integration into the classroom, the general education setting, many of the younger generation and their peers are more comfortable speaking out and saying something. That's a good point.
Yeah, I am one of the only elder millennials that you'll see praising Gen Z, and I am thoroughly impressed with this following generation, because they're at the most dangerous point in their lives, and they don't hold the power like the rest of us do in the hierarchy. But they are unapologetic about their feelings. They are more willing to be open-minded and listen to other people's point of view and absorb some of it and process it. So I work, I'm 39, so I work with a lot of younger people, and every single time I'm thoroughly impressed with their mindset. I know it's trendy to kind of, make fun of the newer generation, but I am very, very impressed by them. I was very impressed yesterday when I rode with two people on the dial ride and listening to their conversations and watching them interact and everything. I was like, I really hope that they're getting employment services in that in the high school that they were leaving, or the academy, because those two students yesterday were very employable. And we just need to reimagine what the box looks like.
Thank you. How about our elder millennial jumping in here?
Who you talking about?
I'm talking about you. You got
Me?
I
I don't know if I mute myself. I guess I call myself an elder millennial. That's such a weird word. But no, I mean, I do think
you got the next
and,
slide.
right, Marcos, to your point, while I do think that Gen Z is doing a great job, there are still lots of us who need to work. So
Yes.
the change can't be 20 years from now. So with the third question, we said that the issue of the type of work for disabled people is a question that few employers consider. As a result, this issue gets shoehorned as either side of either sub-minimum wage or entry-level positions that keep disabled people from finding great jobs that they like. So, I mean, I run into this issue quite frequently as a person with actual degrees and a 10-year work history. So, how do you find a great job that you love? What networks do you use, and how could this be improved? And, obviously we will open that question to anyone that wishes to answer. Candace, of course.
Hey, thanks. So how do I find a great job that I love? Well, it's been over 2 decades now. I started developing a education program for non-disabled people about, oops, sorry. My phone. It's a really terrible ring, but it's the only one that gets my attention. So I started developing an education program for non-disabled people that taught about the experience of disability and our history, the language that we should think about using, what are some of the different types of disabilities. And this program started to come together first for 7th grade kids and then for adults. And I really love teaching this. And so I developed something that could be a skill for me beyond what were the skills that I left university with, which really hasn't been anything that I put into practice. I have a degree in physical education, and I could have been a physical education teacher, but I went in that direction because I got involved with sports and different Paralympic sports. And so as I developed these programs, I started to be able to learn more about what is real advocacy for me, not just self-advocacy, but advocacy in the world. And through that learning, I was able to transition into multiple spaces for employment that I was able to bring forward that
messenger video,
that teaching. And oh my gosh. And it's been something that I've been able to work with for the last couple of decades. And so that's how I got into something that I loved. This last job that I was working at for about a year, they asked me to come in and work for them after hearing about the other work that I did in the education piece. And so the work that I'm transitioning into with the Disability Rights Legal Center here is I'll be developing a training for advocacy for disabled people, as well as putting that education piece for non-disabled people into a different format so that we can get it out to more people. So it was a level of entrepreneurship that I created, and it really was only birthed out of having connected with my disability community and understanding from my perspective that I had to do something about non-disabled people not getting it. So that's how I did it. It was through entrepreneurship.
No, that's a really good point. Obviously the argument of if you don't see something, make it your own, is a great way to look at that. Marie, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
the
Joanna.
biggest problem we have with, especially the younger generation, and this goes back to the educational system, I know you kind of want to talk about it, but is it's still modeled on working with individuals with ID coming out of the high school system. My daughter graduated with a standard diploma, as did her best friend. Between them, one had a 3.8 and one had a 3.4. They took foreign languages, they did all this, but yet when they would go to their special ed classrooms, they would be taught the F's of special ed, career day, fold and fluff, fold and food, filth and food. And they would be in there sorting the little hanger tags for the marshals down the street. And I'd be like, where is the meaningful employment for these higher functioning children? I mean, there are kids who need to have those kinds of job skills taught to them, yes, but when you have kids taking foreign languages, it should be more of a business type model. And when I go to conferences with the ARC and everything, the focus even at those levels is all about, let's build a pretty day support. Let's do this, let's do that. And we need to move this mantra that everybody goes to day support and they're happy at 18, because then that would solve the transportation piece also. If it was more normalized, that people with disabilities would go out. That's just my personal opinion of it.
No, I mean, I think that that's a really good point. We spoke to a woman in our last conversation who they work with primarily with people with intellectual disabilities. And she said that transportation and housing was included in the job position. But one of the things that I had made a comment about was that the work that they do is janitorial. And so I was like, if you're going, I mean, that's a fantastic model. And I applaud them for the initiative to want to put it all together as a singular package, because it does directly speak to what we were just talking about. But at the same time, the type of work that they're doing is janitorial. And while I'm not going to say that there are some people that love that, but that shouldn't be, to your very astute point, it cannot be the end all be all. That cannot be the singular model in which all things are applied. And there really is no nuance in between the way that works.
Absolutely. Yeah. My child did not bust her butt taking anatomy and physiology and chemistry to be a janitor. I mean, that sounds horrible, but that is the truth.
No, that's very true.
Janitors get paid. I just want to point that out. They Melwood works with NASA, so it ain't like they ain't paying their people, because they do, and they make money. But yeah, that's not the point.
Believe me, Intel right here in Chandler, where I was living at right before this, my cousin works there, gets paid very well to keep those because apparently if one piece of dust falls on a chip, that's it, it's fried or something. And so they get paid like expert amount of money to keep that facility. Yes. I like I was mentioning yesterday, the transportation would be an issue for these two students yesterday, and she was the one that was telling the bus driver, no, my copay is $4, and he was like, oh no, it's not, you guys don't have copay. He had to stop the bus like 15 later and be like, oh, you know what, never mind, I was incorrect, you are correct, I'm sorry, and this and that, right? So it's one of these things where there's condescension when you turn these students into experts at certain things, and then pull them back to do remedial jobs. And we're not saying that those jobs aren't important and that the people don't want to do it, but that'd be like me, telling a whole group of marginalized people that they have to do this backbreaking work because that's the only job that they are going to be experts at or good at, or that. But what really bothers me about those programs is not only are you teaching that student with a disability that he can't go anywhere beyond this, you're also teaching that teacher, that assistant teacher, that principal, everybody along the way is going to now have that in their head, that people with disabilities, especially at an intellectual level, can only operate here and they cannot ever operate anywhere else. And that ends up poisoning the workforce and those that are going to train and hire people with disabilities. So mindset has always been a big thing for me, and I always kind of bring it back to mindset, but mindset is a very hard thing to undo when you've already done the damage.
Ryan, did you want to add something? I saw you had your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I do want to add a little bit of flavor to this conversation about, how does someone with disability find work? I am a person with mental health disability, and I work for a multinational tech company. And there is a what we call an employee resource group. It's basically like a social group that you can network with. And there's one called Disability Alliance. And based from that from being involved in that organization, I learned that we actually hire a lot of people with disabilities, either physical, intellectual, or mental health disabilities. From what I've learned, some are working as a quality assurance like engineer, making sure it's like software and bugs are like, being managed, or jobs where they look at numbers or patterns and data to see if there's any like discrepancies, which is useful for cybersecurity and fraud detection. So there are different jobs that people, at least in the company that I work for, that is not medial, that people with disabilities can get involved in. The company that I work for, we have good health insurance. Buses are provided for people, not just people who have disability, but anyone can take the buses because like public transit is an issue in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that's a thing. But I guess like, in the tech world, I'm not sure like if my company is unique or if it's like common where, people with special abilities can contribute to the business cause of an organization because that their skills, it allows them to contribute.
Well, that was the question I was just about to ask, because I was going to say that sounds wonderful. And so my immediate question to that is, does your organization advertise? Do they advertise with disability rights organizations? Like, could people locate them if they're trying to find a job, or is the only way to get that information to be working there? Because
that's a very good question. I'm not sure if they're like advertising jobs like in specific websites that would lure people with disabilities and whatnot. All I know, like when I applied for the job, like during the interview process, they would ask me like, hey, there was an email that got sent saying, do you require any special assistance or accommodations so that you can complete the interview process? So that was the tone that I encountered in the beginning, even before being hired, is that like they would ask the applicant, do you have special needs or requirements for you to complete the interview? But as far as advertising, I'm not sure, because the only source for me when I applied for that job was through LinkedIn, and also being fortuitous that like a friend of mine works for that organization. So it was networking.
Let me ask a different question. Does your organization, do they use disabled people in their marketing? I asked this question because
so I work for like one of the subsidiaries. We do like advocate for DEI. So there are different people. So I work in the healthcare side, and there are like one or two people who have like who show physical disability, like in the videos that we created. Also, like we kind of like the company wide, they changed the logo to accommodate like different festivities or events or cause. In one of the modification of the logo, the letter O was changed so that like it was a person in a wheelchair. So there, I guess to briefly like answer your question, like yeah, there is some, but like, you know, I might just, maybe my experience is just unique and not like the, you know, like more of an outlier than like, you know, what is commonly out there. But
Sure. I just want to clarify. I asked that question because I feel like a lot of companies and a lot of employers want to do, they do it the way that you suggested. Like your first commentary or first introduction to disability is through the accommodations question, or like, what do you need to do this job, right? But my
no,
argument
to
is
do
that's
the
where it
interview.
stops.
It was how, what do you need to, what kind of accommodation do you need so that you can be successful during the interview?
Sure.
Yeah.
Like, and that's what I'm saying. I guess the difference is accommodation versus disability culture, because this is what I told the World Health or the World Bank, that y'all are great at accommodations, but you have no disability work culture in your building. And they didn't even know what I was talking about. And I was like, it's people who work in the building with visible disabilities and invisible disabilities. It's putting that stuff in communication through marketing and outwardly. It's like, basically, you shouldn't have to ever think, when is the last time I interacted with a disabled person at my job? Like, that should never be, like, if you're doing it correctly, that should never be you shouldn't ever have to think really hard about it. And if you do, then it means that they're not doing it the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so basically you're talking about like culture versus like marketing.
Yeah,
and
I
how
mean,
like,
culture versus accommodation.
yeah,
Like, you know, like, besides people doing what is right, because I feel like accommodation is what is right versus a culture which is just organic.
yeah. I
And by the way, I'm not picking on
all,
your
all I
company.
know right now,
Yeah.
like I'm like, because the organization is big and I mainly work at home, so I
Sure.
don't get to interact with people a lot. But like the social events that I've attended recently, it involved one person with vision impairment, and but you know, we as a group, like, you know, included her in the social activities. Um, but I'm not sure if that's like the norm throughout the organization, but like maybe just a group that like I met. But right now, like for me, like it's hard to gauge the culture when I'm actually working from home, you know?
I was going to highlight that a little bit. If we are moving or trying to move to have, you know, these companies and corporations have more of a disability culture, is the main thing that is helping us right now, which is this, right? To be able to communicate with each other, you know, across vast distances about disability. Is it at the detriment of creating disability cultures at these companies? Because now you don't have, you know, D'Arcee going and having the lunch with the people from that organization to be able to see other people physically in their space with disabilities, or be saying things that are detrimental to our community also.
That's a good question. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Joanna had her hand raised on this topic, Joanna?
Yeah, kind of an amalgamation. But I think as far as that question that you're asking, I think it could probably work both ways, right? Because if you're remotely working and, you know, you get all your projects done or whatever, then, and people know that you have some things that you're working around, and then that's a demonstration that, hey, you know, quote unquote disabled people can do the jobs, right? So that's kind of a demonstration of that. And it may also make it easier, you know, to get certain jobs in that, or to keep them, because you don't have transportation and all that kind of stuff. But also on the other hand, you know, like what you guys were saying earlier, if everybody's working remotely, you don't get used to seeing that person with a seeing eye dog, or you know, a wheelchair or whatever. So I think it could probably go both ways.
Thank you. We had another, oh, Candace, did you have something on this before we moved?
Yeah, and I wanted to add, because it's, this is a really important piece, is that the environment has to change. And in the workspace, if we're working from home and in the office, and there's a lack of, visually seeing disabled people in your environment, that is inhibiting any type of inclusion and connectivity, then we have to figure out how we be connected. We have to come up with new ways to connect and learn about each other and engage and create that culture that D'Arcee was talking about, because it's a critical piece of what community looks like, what the workspace looks like, because a workspace is a community, and it has been really stagnant for a very long time. And then the other piece I wanted to add was in resources, independent living centers more and more are places where people can get information about employment and also learn new skills. We have one center here in the county of Los Angeles that is been far and above placing people in employment over and over and over. And so those I think are really overlooked, because I, as a disabled person, never really thought that engaging with an independent living center was something I needed to do. And because I didn't really understand what the availability was of their resources. And only at the beginning of the pandemic did I really begin, which is, there's a level of like, oh my gosh, why didn't I know that the SILs are really a space that is engaging with a lot of the federal government agencies, and they get first information on what's going down. And so being connected to our SILs is a resource.
That's a very good point. And as D'Arcee says, it's been on our list, trying to get them to engage more with critical advocacy purposes, and that they should be a one-stop shop.
Yeah, I am. That's a two-sided coin for me. So I was born and raised in a rural community on the border. So when I had my entry, I came up here to the Phoenix area for a little bit, and then for about 3 or so months, and then I went back home and lived there about a year until I was like, I need to go back up to, I need to either go to San Diego or I need to go to Phoenix. And San Diego wasn't accepting any applications, so I came up to Phoenix. And it was specifically because of a Center for Independent Living, and we didn't have those types of resources in the Yuma area, or rural America struggles a lot with those things. But I also think that during the pandemic was where I saw them drop the ball or ignore things that they should have been on top of. When I feel like they're an organization that are supposed to be champions for us, and a lot of the times they were like the rest of us trying to figure out what was going on, and I became disillusioned with what they were doing with the capabilities that they had. It wasn't that I don't think they have the power to do it. I think they either didn't know how to approach it or were too scared to actually step forward and say, you guys are harming us with these policies or this lack of resources to our organization. So yes, I believe in the dream of a powerful Center for Independent Living and state independent living centers. I just think that a lot of the times they aren't willing to make the really hard decisions of saying, no, you are wrong and you need to listen to us because you're harming us.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I think this whole question of sales and their play, that's a whole other discussion that I definitely think we need to have, because they are a critical piece to, you know, how we envision this work moving forward. But, you know, in the interest of time and to make sure that everybody, you know, that we honor the time that you've given us, we just wanted to add, so the last couple of questions really was this question about, like, if you're employed already, what is it that your workplace does that you like? You know, how do they keep you? Because retention is really important. And I don't think anybody ever talks about that side of the equation for disabled people. And then the other question is that, you know, it's not a secret that diversity and inclusion is like the hot button item. Besides that and critical race theory, which I am happy to be in both of those camps. You know, it's not a secret that D&I has become like a huge thing. But do y'all really think that disability, I mean, I hear it occasionally, but as Marcos was saying, it's kind of, you kind of feel like you're in an echo chamber and that only certain people are hearing the message. So do y'all think that disability is being addressed enough in this new age of diversity and inclusion? And if it's not, what do you think could be done so that way we can actually get that message out? So just to recap, if you are working and you're a disabled person, what does your workplace do to keep you? And then the second question is, do you think the disability is being addressed enough in diversity and inclusion?
Candace.
And yeah, Candace, of course you can start.
Oh, okay. And so what's my workplace doing so I'm going to be moving into a new one. And we've already talked about the piece of having the authority to be able to bring forward changes that need to happen in the environment so it's more inclusive and there's more access. And also because we're developing some programs that I have expertise in, that I have a leadership role in, that isn't not being overrode by other people in management that have been there longer. Because I have a level of expertise in the area that we're developing it. So we've already talked about like having the authority to be able to say, this is not working. And I can show you why it's not working in the environment to create access, inclusion, equity for disabled people. And how do we come together to change that so that it is more inclusive? So that's already been talked about. And there's an opportunity for me to, you know, climb the ladder, so to speak. And that's already been disclosed to me, that, you know, as we bring these pieces forward and we see growth with it, there's an opportunity to move into a different position. That's interesting to me. So do I think disability is really a part of the DEI conversation? No, I don't think it is enough. It isn't. And I said this earlier, I'll say it again because it bears repeating, that oftentimes people think inclusion means access, and it doesn't. Because we can be at the table, but if we don't have access to authority, then there isn't a real opportunity to affect change. And I have been in positions in corporate where it looked like I had a level of authority, but once I pushed against it, it wasn't really there, and the changes weren't being made. So I don't think it's a part of the conversation. And I really do think one of the main reasons it isn't is that level of fear from lack of knowledge around disability and believing the old bias and stereotypes that people have been taught, that disabled people aren't capable, that they don't have value. And I mean, our history is one of either being destroyed or put out of sight in an institution. So we have to dismantle that as we move forward in the DEI space. And most groups that are oppressed groups don't recognize their disabled folk. And we see that across the board, in women's spaces, in Black spaces, and LGBTQA+ spaces. We see that across the board, that we are excluded from any kind of movements in a major way, where there's a real equitable space for us to be able to participate. And so I feel like we're the last frontier.
I was gonna say, until you need something. And I throw that card out once again. Yeah, these are really, really great points. I would open it up, Marie or Michael, if y'all want to add something to this before we go, you're certainly allowed to do so. And of course, Ryan and Joanna, you are also welcome to chime in on this if you would like.
I'm just taking it all in because my daughter and she's only been out of school a couple years. She graduated, literally had the diploma thrown through the car window during the height of the pandemic in her lap. And we're still finding our way. And I have some issues with the groups that are doing advocacy and front and center for our kids, as I call everybody, because I think they're basing it off of knowledge that was here a few years ago. And I think that's in fact affecting employment. Recently, I went to a conference like 3 weeks ago, and there were a lot of self-advocates there. Most of them were under the age of 21. And there was this great debate about, for example, person first language. Some of them are highly offended by it. Where a lot of people spent years saying we have to do person first language. They're like, no, I'm an autistic person. Wherever people were like, no, we're a person with autism. And I think as this younger generation comes about, we're going to have to do a better job at being even more inclusive within the disability community itself, instead of pigeonholing everybody into a one size fits all position, because the needs of Marcos, for example, and the needs for Candace are not the needs of my 21-year-old daughter, who is the peak of the wave of the autism tsunami coming at this country. And that is what troubles me when I go to conventions and when I hear people speak about, well, I'm doing a platform, for this society or that society. I'm like, we have to make sure there's a voice of every generation being represented in every disability as much as we can in these kind of.
I'm gonna jump in right after that because you make a great point, Marie. So when I started my advocacy work, it was obviously with people with spinal cord injuries. And as I started doing more work, I saw how exclusionary that was to other disabilities. And I've spoken about it with this group. The hierarchy had, as somebody who's never been at the top of the hierarchy other than being a white passing male, which is a pretty high up there on the totem pole, is people with spinal cord injuries. And we're going to advocate for our needs and everything, but then we need to understand that there's also other marginalized groups who might have more skin in the game and might have a better outlook at how to solve a problem. So I like building very long tables with lots of seats and lots of space to roll up in. So I definitely hear what you're saying.
Thank you. I was going to say, and I mean, that's a really, really good point. We're almost at time. So Joanna, why don't you take us out with our final thought?
Oh gosh, I don't even know exactly where we are, what question we're on, because we've covered so much. I guess I would say it's for me in the job, I've had to advocate for myself sort of through the job. But what keeps me there is that I enjoy it, and I am close enough to retirement that I really want to do something that I like and that's not like hard for me in ways that I can't manage well. I would say one thing that I would say, going back to the question about, you know, how do you disclose or what do you say, is that when I first applied for the job, I got this note from the person who was going to interview me that was talking about this one tiny piece of the job that I would not be able to do physically. But it's in a setting where it's like a lot of people divide up the tasks. So I was really tempted not to go to the interview, but then my brother said, go ahead and go. So I did. And when I presented my other skills and stuff, they were like, oh, well, we can work around that other piece. And I think if I hadn't had the nerve to go, then I wouldn't be there, you know? So those are my thoughts about those things.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, thank you so much for sharing. I think that that's really, really important. I mean, I think the bottom line, all of this is we have to physically go. We got to physically show up. Like if we're trying to do any of this and make this a real thing, you know, I think it's so tempting for people with disabilities to literally be like, no, I'm not, you know, worthy or capable, or no, someone else is going to take that job away from me because they're more qualified than I am. And I think that is the biggest lie that society has convinced disabled people, is that, as Candace has said repeatedly, you know, society isn't built for disabled people, but that doesn't mean that we don't get to at least show up and knock on the door.
And Ryan,
Because, you know,
Ryan makes a point in chat about physical disability and mental health disability, and he's struggling to navigate the space since his disability isn't apparent. So we always
Right.
have to remember, yes, thank you. Thank you, Ryan.
And I think that, like I said, that's one of the reasons why I said, you know, I think employee disability groups are great, but they need to have power attached to them. You need to have the ability to speak to someone with actual power who can change and manifest these things, because it shouldn't be so difficult to navigate. And I think you'll find more CEOs have invisible disabilities than you know, which is also the point. So thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you very much to everybody that came here, that gave up their time. We're very happy to have had you here. And we're gonna take this information, and like I said, we're gonna make notes and take it back to our people. And there will be more conversations. This is not the only one, but this is a start. And so moving forward, you know, Ryan, I may come to you specifically to talk about more mental health resources that we can put together, because again, I think that's a really good point. And, you know, maybe it's as simple as dedicating a specific area of discussion for that specific thing. You know, we don't really know, but we will be back in touch with everyone. So thank you so much. And if y'all missed, for people who weren't able to make it today, this is a recorded session. So we will be sending out this recording for people to see and for folks to get in touch with us. So thank you again, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.